Welcome to another episode of Discover You, our podcast exploring innovative and effective solutions to issues in mental health. I'm JD Kalmenson, CEO of Montclair Behavioral Health, a family of dynamic and comprehensive mental health centers in Southern California. We are here at Emerging Themes, the Behavioral Health Conference, catching up with some amazing innovators who are reshaping the treatment space with fresh breakthroughs and new approaches. Today, I'm thrilled to have a conversation with one of our speakers, Rizzo, PhD, a leading expert in the use of virtual reality and technology in mental health treatment. Dr. Rizzo is a clinical psychologist. He's the director of medical virtual reality at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies and a research professor in USC's Department of Psychiatry and in the USC Davis School. His work focuses on developing virtual reality systems for clinical assessment, treatment, and rehabilitation in areas like PTSD, autism, ADHD, Alzheimer's. And so this is something that is so cutting edge and so new. First of all, thank you for being with us, Dr. Rizzo.
Thanks for having me.
Before we even begin, what sparked your interest in virtual reality? When was it? And maybe it's actually older than some people even think.
Yeah. Well, the light bulb moment was when I was doing work in brain injury rehab as a psychologist and neuropsychologist. And this was from 85 to 94. And during that time, we didn't have much technology. It was, a lot of paper and pencil, assessments and workbook exercises and so on. And one day, one of my clients came bursting into my office, 22-year-old, frontal lobe injury from a car accident, hard to maintain motivation in any of the rehab activities that we offered. And he comes bursting in, he goes, "Skip, you got to see this. It's a new thing." I go, "What?" He goes, "It's called a Game Boy. Watch." And I saw him, he's bent over, and he's playing Tetris. And he was like a Tetris warlord, but not just that. 20 minutes, I just sat there and watched him in awe, because this was a kid you couldn't motivate for more than 5 or 10 minutes at the most to do traditional rehab. But here he was glued to this thing. So I thought, if we could bottle that, if we could translate rehab into an activity that was that engaging, maybe we'd go somewhere. And so I started bringing games into the clinic, computer games. Sim City was one of the early ones on my Nintendo NES system. That's how old I am.
Wow.
And they loved it, but the interface was clunky, using a gamepad for complex decisions in an active executive function activity like that. So then I learned about VR, and that was it. When I learned about VR, the compelling element of it is we could design simulations that we could immerse people in, and we could systematically do the kinds of drill and practice activities, but in a context relevant for the real world. And maybe we could gamify some of that, give people feedback, compare their performance with the day before. Well, that was a great vision. I wrote a paper on it. And it got a little bit, that was 94.
94.
And it got a little traction. And then I actually tried real VR at that time. It's like, oh my God, this isn't what I thought it would be, because the technology was very immature at the time. Very cartoony graphics, small windows in a VR headset and so on. But you could see that was where one future would lie ahead. So 95, I had an opportunity to take a postdoc at USC. I left my clinical work, moved to the Alzheimer's Center at USC, which was a strategic move because it was right across the street from computer science. So I would spend my afternoons going over to computer science and bugging people with these ideas. And one day this guy said, "I know somebody with equipment. It's an idea that's sound." It was a visual spatial assessment and training idea. And he goes, "And I've got a student programmer." And it was like, okay. And that was the start of it. And the lab built from that, originally targeting cognitive assessment and rehab, but then later branching out into other areas of, exposure therapy for PTSD or role play training with folks on the autism spectrum with virtual humans,
So essentially, virtual reality in its clinical use is the ability to control a setting, to engage in the stimulation or the exercising or whatever the particular intervention that you're seeking to do, and having it really just sort of mapped out, minusing out all the other variables that might otherwise compromise that process.
You said it in a nutshell. Basically, we're talking about the ultimate Skinner box.
Right.
A controlled stimulus environment that you can design around whatever the clinical need is, whether it's exposure for anxiety disorders or distraction from acutely painful procedural pain procedures, or gamifying rehab. And so you just build these worlds, and then you can not only systematically control the stimuli that appear in those worlds, but you're also measuring performance in a more natural way. It's not just right, wrong, but it's body action, it's head turning, all these things that you get for free with VR, because it's essential to track the user's body and head movement, to update the graphics in real time.
Wow.
To make the environment compelling, make it realistic.
Very interesting. When did virtual reality become a household term? And it's not only in the clinical sense, but just in society, in Silicon Valley. How recent is that?
Well, I think it's been a roller coaster of the high end starting in '92, probably after the movie The Lawnmower Man came out, Brett Leonard's classic adaptation of a Stephen King novel about VR and about trying to take somebody who had intellectual deficits in combination with drugs and VR experiences, do rehab. And that actually kicked off the first hype cycle in the early to mid 90s. But then, as I found out when I first tried VR, the vision was a little bit ahead of the capacity for the technology to deliver. And so it kind of had a nuclear winter in the late 90s. But in university labs, people, that could build this stuff were doing it. And there was always the academic activity that continued. Then there was another little bump when the Nintendo Wii came out, and that isn't VR so much as it's natural interaction, even though it was kind of faked. But people could. It showed us that people wanted to interact with games beyond what they could do with their thumbs, and so it was body action. Microsoft Kinect came out, but the next big jump was around 2014 with the formation of Oculus, a company that ended up getting purchased by Meta. This guy, Palmer Luckey, who had worked in our lab previously, realized that with the advances in cell phone screen technology, you could build low-cost VR headsets with reasonably high fidelity. I mean, these screens previously would cost a couple $1,000s per eye, so very expensive. But now with mass production of cell phones, there were pennies. And so all of a sudden, a head-mount display became a practical tool. And that kicked off the next great wave of VR, which we're still riding now, because these companies have continued to evolve headsets. Apple's in the mix now with the Vision Pro augmented reality headset where you can see through the real world. And I have a virtual version of you sitting in that chair, or you could do the
holograms, right?
Yeah.
I think it's the first time I saw one, and it was an artist who had passed away, one of my favorite. I got goosebumps. It's just so authentic, and fortunate. It's not always that you have gaming, commercial, for-profit, actually inadvertently fueling and helping neurology and and behavioral health. So this is like such a beautiful synergy, even though it's not planned and it doesn't even have that
we
level.
lucked out.
Yeah. It's really the most extraordinary innovators and programmers. It's really special. Let's talk about PTSD for a second.
Sure.
Because I know that a lot of the work that you're doing with virtual reality is really providing an efficacious intervention for PTSD, which is so common, It's not going away. And despite all the talk about it, the actual, sort of volume of evidence-based interventions that are effective are not as many as people would think. So maybe give us a little bit of a high-level overview of what current PTSD interventions are doing and how VR sort of changes the landscape.
Well, I think what VR brings to the table here is a way to systematically create simulations of traumatic events that you can put a person in at a pace they can handle to help them engage with their trauma narrative. Probably the best evidence-based approaches, and there's only really 3 that fit this category, is trauma-focused therapy. And it's the idea that you help a person to confront and reprocess difficult emotional memories rather than avoid. And so you see prolonged exposure, EMDR, cognitive processing therapy is really a trauma-focused therapy, except you're writing about the trauma. And so what we do with VR is not a giant leap away from the evidence-based
Right, the concepts, the philosophy.
Yeah.
It's just giving it more accuracy.
Yep. And helping patients that would be difficult to engage in imagination to try to conjure up the thing that they've been spending months, years, decades avoiding thinking about, or avoiding going to places that trigger those memories. Now we can put them in gradually. So we've done work with veterans that have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and that started in 2004. So we've got 20 years of research, randomized controlled trials. And one of the key findings is, we get results that, in terms of efficacy, that equivalent across all people, equivalent to the best evidence-based imaginal exposure app. But, and this is where a precision medicine view comes in, we predicted in our last randomized controlled trial that VR would have better efficacy when a person had PTSD and comorbid major depression, because those are people that are hard to activate and engage, but you could put them in a VR simulation and all of a sudden, it might not be an exact replica of where their trauma happened.
That's what I was going to ask you. Talking about exact replica, how sophisticated is it? Let's say somebody was abused by an individual. Do you take a picture of that person, put it into
You could do that. And we're doing things like that with sexual trauma PTSD. Now, we've completed a safety and feasibility trial where we had built out, is a big issue in the military sexual trauma.
Sure,
we built out some of our military contexts, but it turned out most people suffering from military sexual trauma, it happens stateside. And so we built out a bunch of civilian contexts, places, bars, alleys, cars, motel rooms, barracks, shipboard offices, as well as Army offices and so on. And we can put people in those environments and help them at a pace they can handle.
Right. That's the
narrate and talk about it. And sometimes, this stuff is so emotionally evocative that even if it's not an exact replica, the context is enough. And these folks start talking about things that they've never talked to anyone about before. A veteran doesn't want to burden his family or his friends sometimes. They don't want to go see a therapist. The same thing with sexual trauma. There's a shame or a stigma. But all of a sudden, all these years or however long start pouring out. And now the therapist is not just doing exposure. Exposure takes the cork off the bottle, but the genie that comes out is where a lot of the traditional, talk therapy, whatever your perspective on talk therapy or discipline in that area, now you've got an active, engaged patient.
Very interesting.
We've actually expanded the work now to Ukraine. We partner with Ukrainian developers that are building out the contexts that are culturally relevant, and we have a partnership with Ben Gurion University in Israel to build out content that's kibbutz relevant as well as Gaza relevant.
Wow.
So
very interesting.
I would say, off the cuff estimate, probably 60% of people that engage in psychotherapy the issues they're addressing has some root in a past trauma, whether it's adverse childhood experiences or wartime trauma or pathological grieving or whatever. You can always trace it in a good number of folks.
Amazing. A couple of very technical questions.
Sure.
A therapist who's engaging with a client who's using virtual reality, going through that experience, does that therapist need any type of special certification or training?
With our applications, you have to have certification in prolonged exposure. So
Okay.
the
General
method.
prolonged exposure, not necessarily VR, general prolonged exposure, they could apply those principles
in
to
the
this,
VR,
in
but
the
we have
VR.
a training program.
But you
for
got to be
using-
trained for
Yeah.
prolonged exposure, because a lot can come up
Yeah.
that wouldn't ordinarily in a regular talk.
And you got to know how to
therapies.
operate the equipment, because
Right.
the clinician you don't just put somebody in and it
No,
doesn't
it's
work. They're
right.
adjusting
Right.
things in
Right.
real time. The
Right.
patient talks about, and then a guy came out from a corner in the distance with a gun. Click. That guy
How does that make you
walks
feel?
out. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So
Gotcha.
they're controlling time of day, number of people, explosions,
Wow.
shady characters, all from this like Wizard of Oz control.
Very
panel.
interesting.
And one of the added benefits I think of that is when I was back in the day, I worked with Vietnam veterans on my VA internship, and I never served. And so I had no credibility to them anyway. I'd often say, well, I don't have to be schizophrenic to work with people that have schizophrenia, and I
Right.
do that too. But what we hear from patients now is that I feel as if you understand my situation better because, and they don't use this term, but because we've co-constructed the world. Because the clinician is picking the world and changing things up and everything and seeing it as the client is walking through it.
To a certain degree, the clinician is there with them in that moment. So that's extraordinary. I never even thought about that aspect of it.
It was an added thing.
Another technical question. So PTSD, it can come from violence, it can come from sexual trauma, it can come from other forms of trauma. Do you find that the VR is more effective in any specific domain or type of trauma than others, or is it more effective in a general way, equally?
I would have to default to the generic. It's useful for activating the emotion, but especially with people that also have comorbid depression. I don't think we've done enough research to be able to say
Pinpoint
one or
that
the
this trauma
other.
is more of, okay, got it.
Yeah.
Very understood. Well, another question is, in the future, when this becomes more widespread, do you anticipate or would you support an initiative similar to the way an antibiotic is actually a healthy injection of bacteria so your body can build up its immune system? Would there ever be a thought process that people should actively engage in a VR version of some type of adversarial experience to actually give us a greater degree of resiliency, toughen us up, as it were?
You know, there's two lines of evidence for that. Number one, we built out a pre-deployment system from our PTSD exposure therapy treatment. And this was designed for service members before they went to war to go through a mission and to have it all go bad. And then a virtual mentor walks out in the scene and walks them through various coping strategies. Like if it's, it gives people permission to have kind of freaked out. They're in a Humvee that gets blown up. And then the character says, okay, you survived this and you're very anxious. It doesn't mean you're a wimp. It's acute stress. Now there's strategies for dealing with acute stress. Let me guide you through a breathing exercise. So we developed a series of these scenarios that the Army has used, but they haven't done the research to really show. But in another area, there was recently a study on cardiac surgery where patients, before they went into surgery, they went into a VR world that showed what they would be going through, going into, the pre-care room and then, being moved into the operating room and all that. And you might think that might be frightening and might cause rumination, but actually patients reported it gave them an honest idea as to what to expect, and it reduced their anxiety. So, is it, a spoonful of medicine makes the hurt go? I don't know.
Preventative. It sounds like there's preventative opportunity here.
I think there are.
Preventative. That would be amazing. How widespread is this? Is it available on the market? If I'm a client, I'm a patient, I'm looking to avail myself to this, where can I find virtual reality therapy?
Well, as far as large medical systems implementing it, which I think is a major step, we see the VA operating. They've got something like 4,400 VR units across 180 VA medical centers addressing pain management, pain distraction, physical therapy, cognitive rehabilitation, PTSD, of course, anxiety disorders, substance use with cue exposure strategies and relapse prevention. So we're seeing that. As far as clinical practice, there are a number of companies that specifically license, like if your primary practice is exposure therapy for phobias, you can buy a $300 headset, a Meta Quest, that connects to the cloud, and you have a tablet and you can pick, okay, I want the agoraphobia scene, or I want the fear of flying scene, bing. And then you can systematically control if it's flying, it's a nice smooth flight that you put a person on, or as they get more comfortable, you make turbulence. So there are companies that produce that kind of content. And probably the biggest area actually is in physical therapy now. There is probably 8 companies that are producing this kind of game-based, highly interactive and measurable.
So it is out there in some of it.
You have to look for it.
You have to look for it, but only in some of the indications. For example, do you have it out there for PTSD?
No, because we have it in the VA and in private practice, but we don't make that available for patients to download and treat themselves.
But if a clinician or a clinic wanted to, that would be possible. And if, let's say, a clinic was licensed it out, do they have the tools to customize the scenes, to customize the VR for the patients? They do have that.
Yeah, that's part of the software package, where you have a clinician interface that adjusts everything in the headset.
Wow.
And, it's part of the package.
That's amazing. Is there some type of an FDA version of approval that it would have to get, or because it's done in conjunction with a therapist, it doesn't need to be FDA approved?
See, that's the thing. It doesn't necessarily need that. It all depends on the claims you make, but also, are you using the VR to deliver an already evidence-based strategy?
Correct.
I'm getting reimbursed to do exposure therapy, whether I'm doing it in imagination or VR.
Right. It's just enhancing it. It's not actually creating an alternative modality.
Right.
But it does get technical, because if it was FDA approved, then insurance might add, a certain reimbursement for this. And
there are a lot of companies that are moving towards trying to get FDA approval so they can get reimbursed from Health and Human Services. And like we've developed an assessment tool for ADHD, but it's an attention process assessment, a headset application, virtual classroom, and it's a product. It's got norms and everything. In order to get reimbursed for that specific type of an assessment, we are going the FDA
very interesting
process.
Are there downsides? Are there any side effects? Not really.
With kids, actually kids are quite resilient, but you do see a certain percent of the population get this kind of motion sickness, and that typically resolves quickly or over time as you do it in repeated sessions. You see less of that, and the technology's gotten so much better that you don't really see it as much as in the past. There's no lag when you move your head and so on. But you just have to accept there's going to be 10-15% that maybe this isn't for them.
Right. I mean, as of now, it's not yet in the mainstream. Do you anticipate that changing in the next few years?
I think so.
Are there a lot of research institutes that are primarily focused on VR, or is it more?
I'm seeing more and more of it. The VA was a big mission that we had, and it started with the PTSD work, but then now has expanded. And now that, it's not so much that the VA, they got to a point where it wasn't about, well, do you have another randomized controlled trial? They saw that there was evidence for using these tools, and they saw that their veteran population liked it and they wanted that. And so the VA took the step saying, we want to bring all these in and we're going to do research ourselves and pragmatic clinical trials and so on. But then the trouble they ran into was they had 4,400 sites, they had 35 different types of software that each had different interfaces and had different head mount displays that they were using. And so it became kind of overwhelming to manage it. So now the VA has an initiative called Made for VA, and it's a set of requirements that they give in advance to developers that your system has to run this way. It's got to follow a generalized format for an interface to, for the clinician. It's got to have training. And so that's, I think those have been the barriers to implementation, is not the cool, sexy stuff about building an app to address an idea, but how do you pragmatically get it out the door?
How do you get rid of all the bugs and all the that makes a lot of sense. And what's really interesting about everything that I'm hearing is that this is not going to really take away the human element in behavioral health. It's just enhancing and exponentially making the efficacy more pinpoint, more accurate, more controlled. So it sounds like something that really is a special gift. Thank you for the work that you're doing, bringing it to as many people as possible. And this has been a very illuminating discussion. And I really hope that whoever's watching and listening takes the time, researches how this can be more helpful, and maybe there's somebody in your life who can benefit from such a thing. Thank you for joining us today, Skip. We really appreciate you taking the time. And God bless you and all the wonderful work you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Of course.